G'day, Papaya Koala here. Welcome to the 2026 Formula One season. A proudly international championship where drivers from all over the world gather to compete against Britain's predetermined next world champion. We're back for the 2026 F1, an allegedly international championship that just happens to feature 5.5 British drivers on a grid of 22. A parade of Brits in fast cars, how very colonial. Statistically speaking, that already gives Britain fairly healthy odds of ending up with the trophy. Add in the selective stewarding decisions, the endlessly evolving regulations bent toward a specific British driver-led team, looking at you, Arrows, and a media narrative that is desperately focused on convincing us all the ways in which we should all be happy to celebrate the latest British frontrunner before the season has even begun. And this year, that spotlight appears to have settled rather comfortably on George. Not because he's the best, because he most certainly is not, but because, after several seasons in the paddock, he's apparently done his time. You know, the same logic that delivered the title to Lando last year. And in British Formula One, it appears that the storyline arrives before the racing does. Quick one before we start, the following contains satire, sarcasm, and analysis delivered with Australian honesty. Viewer discretion advised if you prefer your Formula One commentary completely neutral. Well, it's over. The 2026 Formula One season lasted exactly one race. And if you're part of the Koala crew, it appears there's not much to look forward to. Because judging by what we just witnessed, the championship appears to already be decided. And surprise, surprise, or not, it looks like yet another British driver. The Arrows suddenly have another spicy engine rocket car. George looks suspiciously smug. And the rest of the grid is downshifting on the straights just to keep enough battery to finish the lap. Meanwhile, Oscar's race ended before it even started, thanks to a rather dubious power spike and the Aussie GP curse. So today we're asking the important question. Did Formula One accidentally engineer the least exciting car race in history? But first, let's rewind to the start of the weekend. Practice actually gave us hope. Yes, real hope. Across the sessions, we saw multiple teams topping the timesheets, including Oscar in FP2. And crucially, for the Koala crew, Oscar outperformed Lando in every sector. Yes, every single sector. Which of course meant things were looking far too promising for PK Papaya fans. And if last season taught us anything, McLando will find a way to intervene. Meanwhile, Kimi was setting genuinely impressive times, right up until he introduced the car to the wall in rather spectacular fashion. Let's just say the Arrow mechanics got an unexpected pre-quali training exercise. Qualifying started with Oscar putting in some very solid laps, while Lando struggled a lot with the car once again. Meanwhile, Max exited Q1 without even setting a time after his car locked up and launched itself off track. To be clear, that one looked very much like the car, not the driver. Carlos Hare's car also suffered terminal issues earlier in the weekend and never made it to qualifying. AM, with serious car problems, failed to get Stroll's car ready in time. Alonso nearly dragged his own wounded AM into Q2 but was narrowly beaten by Cola Pinata. Meanwhile, the Arrow mechanics somehow rebuilt Kimi's destroyed car fast enough to avoid a Q1 exit. Full credit to the Arrow Lego department. Honestly, they deserve a podium for that alone. Sadly, both Valtteri and Checo were unable to escape Q1 in Caddy's first qualifying outing. Early days. But something strange was becoming obvious during qualifying. Drivers were downshifting mid-straight just to recharge batteries. And despite what racing movies would have us believe, that does not make the car go faster. Which meant the fastest racing series in the world now looked like drivers deliberately slowing down on the straights when they should be at their fastest. Less Formula One, more Formula Chess. Papaya Koala suspects F1 may have lost its way. Now let's talk about optics. Specifically, smug optics. The Arrows were accused all winter of sandbagging. And, based on qualifying, that accusation looks fairly plausible, because what we're seeing feels very familiar. The calm confidence, the quiet smug smiles, the unmistakable nothing to see here energy. Very reminiscent of the early turbo hybrid era, when the Arrows enjoyed a rather convenient and and particularly unfair 2-year development head start. And given the clear performance advantage the Arrows have over their customer teams, it appears they may have been withholding? And perhaps the biggest giveaway of all, George. Now, George has always had a certain hubristic confidence, but this year it has evolved into something closer to insufferably smug serenity. The kind of smug you only see in a driver who knows they're sitting in a car that is, let's say, extremely competitive. Or as Toto once described his Arrows, spicy engine rocket cars. Qualifying ended with P1 Smug George, P2 Kimi, P3 Isaac in his first outing for the Big Bulls. Smug George then told the media the new cars could create very exciting racing. Seriously? Exciting for who? Because historically, when one team is a second faster than everyone else, that doesn't lead to exciting racing. That leads to a parade. Interestingly, the Australian crowd gave Isaac a bigger cheer than the Arrow drivers. You see, Australians have a remarkable talent. We can smell a fix from several countries away. And we don't like it. The only bright moment for Papaya fans? Oscar still qualified ahead of Lando. Small victories. And then, disaster. The race hadn't even started and Oscar was out. His car spun on the curb during the formation lap. Telemetry later showed battery deployment issues causing a sudden torque spike, meaning the car delivered far more power than expected at exactly the wrong moment. Oscar immediately owned the mistake, even though the data suggested the car had other ideas. McLando team management responded quickly. Fat Rat appeared remarkably unsurprised and immediately clarified that it wasn't a problem with the car, which is always reassuring to hear after the car has just done something unexpected. Now, there are two ways to interpret that. Either it was simply driver error, or, purely theoretical of course, he already had a good idea where the torque spike came from. Stella offered a more diplomatic explanation, calling it
It's part driver error and part regulatory flaw,
which is a polite way of saying the system occasionally behaves in ways nobody intended. Several teams have since suggested this quirk may also be a serious safety concern. The FIA will investigate, of course. Expected timeline for any fix? Around July. Which would conveniently give F1's current predetermined champion, Smug George, a rather comfortable if not insurmountable head start. Pure coincidence, I'm sure. But in the meantime, if recent social media is anything to go by, then by July, F1 will have hemorrhaged so many fans that F1 Academy will start looking like the premier racing class. When the race actually started, Charles launched brilliantly and grabbed the lead. Smug George briefly passed him before Charles reclaimed P1 with a masterclass in racecraft. For a few glorious laps, it looked like we might actually have a race. Then Smug George, F1's whinger-in-chief, quickly got on the radio complaining about Charles for defending? That was very dangerous by Charles, especially what we spoke about. Which is odd, because defending is generally considered part of racing. Apparently, nobody told Charles they have already decided to gift the championship to Smug George this year. Lewis Legend also had a strong start and recovered several positions. Kimi and Lando both dropped places, but the standout drive early on was Max. Starting from the back of the grid, by lap 15 he was already inside the top 10. Papaya Koala is now hoping that Max can bring some excitement in what is otherwise looking set to be the most boring season in F1 history. Max repeating 2021 would be great. Isaac's race ended early with engine failure. Virtual safety car deployed. Smug George pitted. Ferraro stayed out with Charles and Lewis running P1 and P2. Lewis Legend suggested splitting strategies. Unfortunately, Ferraro was still busy being Ferraro. When Charles finally pitted, he emerged behind both Arrow cars. This appeared to be because Smug George gained considerably more time under the VSC than expected. Lewis Legend politely suggested this might not be entirely within the rules. But Smug George is British and drives an Arrow, so the stewards were of course remarkably relaxed and typically oblivious. Further down the field, we actually got some real racing. Max and Lando had an entertaining battle, though much of it revolved around battery management rather than outright pace or driving skill. Max simply couldn't harvest enough energy to stay competitive on the straights, which again raises questions about whether these cars are producing the racing that fans actually want. We wanted Formula 1 on steroids, we got Formula E on steroids instead. The sheep media, ever eager to promote their narrative, declared this an amazing race full of passing, but try as they might, even they struggled to sell that narrative, when the passing was entirely artificial. Further back, Ollie Bear and rookie Arvid gave us some excellent wheel-to-wheel moments. Young drivers fighting hard for points, as proper as racing can get in these Franken cars. Well done, guys! More of that, please! And with that, the race was over. Smug George won. Not through spectacular overtaking or amazing racecraft. In fact, in his on-track battles with Charles, Smug George actually lost. But motorsport can be like that. Sometimes the fastest car wins and not the best driver. Second place went to Kimi, who drove a tidy race, but again... Let's not pretend the result was born out of heroic wheel-to-wheel combat. Third was Charles, who, if we're being honest, looked like the driver who actually deserved the win, before Ferraro remembered who they were and delivered one of their classic strategy performances. You know the ones, the sort where you briefly think, wow, they might actually pull this off. And then 10 minutes later you remember why Ferraro fans require therapy. Fourth went to Lewis, legend. Lando held on to fifth, but the drive of the day belonged to Max. Starting last, finishing sixth, setting fastest lap and winning driver of the day. A gentle reminder that talent still matters, even when the F1 narrative would prefer we focus elsewhere. Another interesting statistic, half the top 10 were British. Impressive, sure, but it does reinforce a long-standing suspicion that Formula 1, yes, sometimes feels less like a global championship and more like a very enthusiastic British production that occasionally travels overseas for scenery. Look, F1 says it's international, but if you squint a little and listen to the commentary, you do start to feel like the show occasionally forgets there are other countries involved. And if the outcome of every season begins looking a bit predetermined, then you do have to wonder how long the global audience will stay invested. Racing fans outside Britain do enjoy a bit of uncertainty in their motorsport. We're old-fashioned like that. The Australian crowd had mixed feelings. Naturally, we were disappointed to lose Oscar early, along with our honorary Aussie Valtteri, both victims of the infamous Aussie Grand Prix curse. And since Lando missed the podium, the crowd didn't get to deliver the well-deserved boo that we really wanted to. But the Aussies did have opinions. Because when the commentary spends most of the race explaining why Smug George deserves the championship, even implying that he has already won it before the season has even started. But the reaction tends to be interesting. Mild, polite applause for George, slightly more enthusiasm for Kimi. And the biggest cheer for Charles. You know, the guy who actually made the race worth watching for a while before the script returned to the regularly scheduled British parade. After the race, Smug George did what British race winners traditionally do, explained that the car definitely wasn't a rocket ship, and the victory was entirely down to his heroic driving. Longtime fans may recognise this narrative from the 2014 to 2020 era, which was the last time the Arrows dominated with a 2 seconds a lap faster car, but pretended they didn't. Apparently, it's considered poor form in British motorsport culture to simply say, yeah, the car was amazing today, and I am so lucky to be driving the best car of the grid by miles. Instead, he accused the other drivers of being jealous. And worse still, suggested there was nothing wrong with the other cars, and his performance simply came down to working harder. Now that's an interesting claim, in a sport where every driver on the grid has spent their entire life sacrificing sleep, sanity, and most of their childhood just to reach Formula 1. Apparently the other 20 drivers simply forgot to try? Good to know. But the highlight came when he explained that Lando and Max were only complaining because their cars weren't the fastest, and that he never complained when his car wasn't the quickest. Right, because we all remember the famously never complaining Smug George. Yep, sure. That definitely sounds like him. Not. But there's a tiny detail missing from that argument. The size of the performance gap. Over the last 4 seasons, the difference between Car 1 and Car 20 was often smaller than the gap we're now seeing between Cars 2 and 3. Let that sink in. Right now, Smug George and Kimi have a greater performance edge over the next best car than Max and Lando's had over the Kick team. And remember, last year, Smug George had a car that was more than capable of snagging a win, which it did twice, and came second in the Constructors. The difference? George extracted consistency from his car, not performance. Now, we're supposed to swallow the idea that this sudden second-a-lap advantage just came from working harder? Sure, mate. When Smug George, cruising with a power advantage that's practically a cheat code, declares, "Everyone else should just work harder." It's like winning a marathon on a motorbike. And then telling the runners they just need to hit the gym more. Technically, it's a competition. But let's be real, it's not exactly the same sport. Over at McLando, Lando summed things up bluntly. "I struggled a lot with the car." And this time he's not wrong. They were over a second per lap off the pace. That's not a setup problem, that's an entire postcode problem. Especially interesting when you're a customer team running what is supposed to be the same engine as the factory squad. Because if the factory car disappears into the distance, people start asking awkward but valid questions. We were also briefly treated to Smug George attempting to recreate Max's famous post-race podcast vibe in the cooldown room. Let's just say cringe and smug are not a particularly harmonious flavor combination. But the biggest story of the weekend wasn't the race. It was the mood shift. After practice, the grid looked competitive. The drivers looked excited and optimistic. Then qualifying happened. And everyone realized the arrows had been sandbagging rather enthusiastically during practice and preseason testing. By the end of the race, only two drivers looked happy, Smug George and Kimi. Everyone else looked resigned. The drivers aren't perfectly happy, but everyone else said it was an amazing race. No, George. Literally no one said that, at least no one who wasn't paid to. Social media was flooded with disgruntled race fans of all teams, even the Arrows, who declared this the worst race in years, and were already expecting this to be the worst season ever. The best we can hope for now is for Max to do what he did in 2021 and win against another Arrow that also had a more than a second a lap advantage. It may be the only bright spark that can light up what is shaping up to be the most boring season in F1 history, and the Arrows already set a very low bar for that in 2020. Yeah, unless the FIA does the right thing and intervenes, sooner rather than later. I think we should just give it a chance and see after a few more races. Sure, George, let's wait until your insane power advantage gets you so far ahead that no one can catch you, before we fix an obvious problem that will turn F1 from the pinnacle of motorsport into a snooze-fest parade. Because when the performance gap becomes that obvious, the paddock starts thinking the same thing. Without rapid FIA intervention, preferably well before July, this could be a very long season. Not the exciting kind, not a race, more like a parade led by a very self-satisfied and smug British driver. Which is wonderful if you're British, less thrilling if you're, well, everyone else, despite Smug George's delusional assertion. Because when results start to look predetermined, fans don't get angry. They get bored. They get apathetic. And apathy is far worse for a sport. And if the mood on social media is any indication, July will be far too late. So what do you think? Are these new machines the future of racing? Or are they just Franken cars? Do you prefer flat-out balls to the wall, bravest of the brave, real racing? Or do you prefer the less exciting, strategy-style chess played with cars? Let me know in the comments. And remember, this is Papaya Koala, watching the paddock, raising an eyebrow, and increasing the suspicion level. If you enjoyed this slightly suspicious race review, like and subscribe to Formula Koala, or join if you want to help deliver real race analysis without the scripted narrative. New season, new cars, everything is under control. I spoke too soon, it's a total shit show.